go with it. Are we good? We're good? Where am I supposed to look? Is there a saying that to everybody? Hi, everyone. So welcome to those of you who've joined us in person, and to everybody, hello, out there in virtual world. Glad that you could join us here tonight. We are very excited for this incredible program. So by way of introduction, I'm Meredith Weisbly. I'm the regional director here in the Washington, D.C. office. I hope that everybody is doing well, everybody's families are healthy and happy. But I am really glad that you've chosen to be with us here tonight first to join the Japanese American Citizens League and ADL for the Japanese and Jewish panel on intersection of Jewish and Japanese identity, anti-AAPI hate, and anti-Semitism. I wanted to make sure I got that right as I'm reading it and stuff. So by way of background, ADL and JACL formed a partnership in May to honor both Jewish American Heritage Month and AAPI Heritage Month. And ADL and JACL, hope I don't mix that up, are dedicated to carrying out a series of initiatives that address the critical intersection of anti-Semitism and anti-AAPI hate. Both of the organizations have hosted a reception just recently, actually, in Los Angeles, and Jewish and Japanese leaders featuring the Japanese and Israeli consulates. They're soon going to actually be doing a virtual mission to an internment camp, followed by a discussion of scholars with a background in Holocaust and genocide studies. The panel tonight and the discussion is yet another initiative. It's a way for reflection of the ongoing partnership. And we're very excited tonight to have the opportunity to hear from ADL's Collaborative for Change Fellow, Carmel Tanaka, in conversation with JACL's Education and Communications Coordinator, Matthew Weisbly. I hope I pronounced everybody's names right. And before we begin the panel portion of the evening, first, I really want to welcome Aaron Keyak, who I've not actually had to see in person, or actually not even not had the opportunity to see in person in probably 3 years. So it was wonderful to see you. Aaron is the Deputy Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism at the U.S. Department of State, and he's going to share some opening remarks with us. So, Deputy Special Envoy, I love saying that. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. Very kind introduction. Before I begin my prepared remarks, now I'm at the State Department, so everything is prepared, as Erica knows, and cleared and approved. Something that's come up quite a bit in my brief travels and sort of between the COVID waves and when I do these virtual meetings, not every foreign government appreciates when the anti-Semitism office comes to talk to them about Jew hatred in their country. But something that I often hear when I talk about Jews feeling unsafe in where they live is, well, we don't have to have armed guards at our synagogues. We all know that armed guards, unfortunately, are ever present, especially during the high holidays. And you can't help but see patrol cars and police officers in armed gear. And as much as we have an issue with anti-Semitism here at home, and there certainly is an issue of rising anti-Semitism abroad and all around, we have a gun problem here at home. That means that when anti-Semites choose to do the worst is much worse. There are haters everywhere. There are bigots everywhere. There are people who want to believe in murderous conspiracies everywhere. But when we give them the worst weapons of war, or they have access to the worst weapons of war, the worst is much worse. Anyway, thank you again, Meredith. It's a pleasure to join the ADL and the Japanese American Citizens League for this important and timely event honoring Jewish American Heritage Month and Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We're getting in just under the buzzer. The rise against hate in both the AAPI community and the Jewish community over the last few years is all too familiar for everybody here. From microaggressions in the streets of our cities to significant political attacks to mass shootings, we have seen discrimination fester and grow at an alarming rate. The litany of places that just grows every day is known to all of us, from Pittsburgh to Poway to Colleyville, to Jersey City to Muncie, and virtually daily on the streets of Brooklyn. And the AAPI community has been targeted in Atlanta, and in New York, and San Francisco, and many other cities. I am thankful to Tema and Carly Pildis and others at the ADL who understand that experience of anti-Semitism and other oppressions are not monolithic and often intersect. And that shared historical experience and trauma can unite us in the fight against hatred, which impacts marginalized groups globally. I deeply have valued our discussions over the years and all that I've learned. And the JACL, your important mission to secure and safeguard the civil and human rights of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans and all communities who are affected by injustice and bigotry, help to create a society that honors diversity and promotes the important values of equality and respect. I am most grateful for both organizations coming together and bringing us to important conversations like this. As most of you know, my mandate at the State Department as Deputy Special Envoy to Combat and Monitor Antisemitism means I mainly focus on the hatred of Jews globally. However, as we all know, anti-Semitism cuts across ideology, religion, politics, and nations. Often it's seen with a rise in anti-Semitism, hatred, and intolerance that's directed against members of other ethnic and religious groups and vulnerable communities that society, the very structure of society is at stake. And as such, as you might have heard, Special Envoy Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt and I work closely together to combat this hatred and acknowledge all of its intersections. At a time of growing extremism throughout the world, it would be short-sighted to examine anti-Jewish or anti-Asian hate in a vacuum. We must understand that such extremist ideology is a threat to all Americans. We must work together to break the silos of fighting hate one by one and stand united against this threat. The growth of anti-Semitism and other hatreds undermines the strength of democratic institutions and promotes societies that are less equitable, just, inclusive, and peaceful. The rise of hatred against Jews and all minority communities is a fundamental challenge to the promotion of democratic principles, human rights, and good governance. The lesson of history is simple. And since my boss is a historian, I think our office can speak with great authority on this subject. Simply, a society that tolerates or enables anti-Semitism or hatred of other minorities is one that cannot preserve a healthy democracy, and that fosters respect for human dignity and fundamental freedoms for all. Unfortunately, this isn't even the most recent mass shooting, but we saw in the so-called manifesto of the Buffalo shooter, who senselessly and tragically took the lives of 10 innocent Americans. The manifesto, which I put in air quotes to not give any legitimacy, is racist and anti-Semitic. And we would just relegate it to being a rant if it didn't lead to such violence. It's nearly 30 pages of anti-Semitic language, memes, and graphics. At its core, and not everyone understands the replacement theory. I think when you thought of the chance of the Jews will not replace us, what did that mean? There aren't enough Jews to replace any significant community in America. But what does that mean, Jews will not replace us? It's the belief that there is a so-called white genocide being waged. White people are somehow being replaced. And of course, in their version, that means anything necessary any necessary action must be taken to save white America. Those who believe in replacement theory often think of the Jew as the puppet master, the group responsible for pulling the strings from behind the scenes, manipulating situations for malign purposes. This is a classic form of anti-Semitism in which the anti-Semite punches up. Jews, the anti-Semite is convinced, are richer, more powerful, able to control the rest of society. They revile the Jew, but they also fear the Jew. And it's the fear of the Jews' supposed ability to control society and cause harm to the non-Jewish world that determines for the anti-Semite that the Jew must be fought particularly violently. There was recently a frightening statistic from a study conducted by the Nordic Center for Public Affairs Research at the University of Chicago that 1 in 3, or roughly 32% of Americans, now believe that a group of people is trying to replace so-called native-born Americans with a group of immigrants, a core tenet of replacement theory. In another recent study by the Asian American Foundation, they also found that 33% of Americans believe that Asian Americans are more loyal to another country than the United States. Dual loyalty is something we all have to deal with. Despite the fact that in Buffalo, the target of the shooter's victims were African American, the attack was on all of us, on all minority communities, and the values that underpin our democracy. Naturally, we have many strongly held differences, even in this room, but of course more broadly on a wide range of different topics. There are many lines of division, religious, generational, financial, and political, but it's essential that we stand united in the fight against hate. We are too often divided by the color of our skin, whom we love, how we identify, the way we pray or that we don't pray. And when it comes to combating hate, we can't allow these divisions to further calcify and impede concerted action. As the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs said when speaking about how we saw the Jewish peoplehood, we may not agree on anything, but I don't need you to agree with me, I just need you to care about me. It is precisely dialogues like this what bring together incredible diverse communities that show that we care for the well-being of one another, and that will unite us and make us stronger to fight against all forms of hate. Together we'll continue to fight for the day. Together we'll continue to fight for a day when attending a grocery store or going to school or showing up for work at a spa or attending synagogue does not in fact require an act of courage. So thank you to the ADL, to the Japanese American Citizens League for hosting us all here tonight, and Meredith, for the first time in 3 years.
So thank you to Aaron. We really appreciate the work that you, your team, particularly under the leadership of Ambassador, I love saying that, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, is doing to address anti-Semitism globally. I also appreciate the fact that you brought up what has been happening recently. And we have a saying, you know, at ADL that all hate is interrelated. All hate is equally serious and damaging. So no matter what marginalized community, minority community it is affecting, it has an impact on all of us. And for Black Americans right now, they have a fear because of what happened in Buffalo, and that is not fair. Kids cannot go to school, as you said, without a fear that, you know, instead of holding up a book, they may, you know, to read, they may be holding up to shield a bullet. And I think that that is, you know, for a lot of us who work in this space, it's been a hard few weeks, but it's been a hard few weeks for our community. And that's why I think events like tonight are so impactful. So to everybody who is at home or in an office watching this virtually, I really think it's just, we need to take a moment to pause and reflect and remember why we do events like this. And with that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Elad Strohmayer, who is from the embassy tonight, the Embassy of Israel, to give us some brief remarks. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Meredith, it's good to be here and honored for the invitation. I'm a spokesperson of the Israeli embassy, and I'm a man of words. I always find something to say. It's very difficult to find me in a situation that I don't have words, and I think after yesterday, I'm out of words. It's just painful. I'm trying to find a way to articulate what I feel, and we saw it yesterday in Texas, we saw it last week in Buffalo, and really, I cannot find the words, and it's upsetting, and it's angering me. So I will go to words that are not mine. I'm sure that everyone here are familiar with these words, but I think they're very relevant today, and they're very relevant to this program that we're participating in. First, they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak up because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. By Martin Niemöller, Lutheran pastor who wrote these words in 1946. He made this very famous statement reflecting, of course, World War II and the atrocities of the Holocaust. We learned that in school in Israel, and I know these words from childhood, and I always reflect and think about that. And reading them today before coming here, it made me think again, maybe the motives here are not so good because I'm supporting one community because I'm just afraid of mine. I'm just afraid that I'm going to support you, that when the time of needs come and I need support, you'll come support me. And I think, made me think, is that enough? Is that enough of a reason? Now, of course, it's not his only reason. There is much more than that. I think it's exactly what you said, Meredith. When there is hatred, and Aaron, you said it as well, when there is hatred, it reflects on all of us. And we can have a discussion on different types of hatred. I would argue that anti-Semitism is unique in history, in characters, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if anti-Semitism is unique than other forms of bigotry and hatreds. We all need to stand up together as societies and fight them. We cannot be complicit. We need to speak up. You know, again, as spokesperson, I'm in charge of crafting the message for the Israeli embassy, and we're drafting press releases and tweets. And every time that something horrible happens here in this country, and unfortunately it happens too often recently, there's those who goes to the thoughts and prayers statements. I despise these statements. I said to everyone in my team, we're not doing thoughts and prayers. We're done with the thoughts and prayers. We need action. We need to work as a community together, coming together, different communities, not just that you'll come for me when I need you and I'll come to you when you need me, but because it's the right thing to do. It makes us stronger as a community. And I think what we're doing here today, and ADL and JACL, it's amazing that you're doing this program. And opening my eyes, I'm not familiar with the work of JACL. I didn't know about this organization. I think that makes us stronger in the community, and that's a call for action. That's more than thoughts and prayers. That's working together to prevent the next hate crime, whether it's against a Asian American Pacific Islander, against Jews, against African Americans. We need to prevent that by standing together as a community. I do want to say one thing, and I'll conclude with that, about what brings us together. It's fighting hatred for the good, but it's much more than that. We need to find our commonalities. The way to fight hatred is to find what brings us together. And I think reading a little bit of Carmel's bio, that's a great example of societies coming together, different cultures coming together, because Japanese culture and Israeli culture couldn't be more different. Couldn't be more different. Like, we're loud, we're vocal, we're very non-reserved. And Japanese culture is a much more reserved culture, more on the nuance. And if we can find a common ground with these communities, that means that we can work together. Because we have so much common grounds that bring us together. So instead of spreading the message of hate, and the way to fight it is to spread the message of love. And don't joke me, but I came with my rainbow socks today because I think that's the message that we need. And as a representative of the state of Israel, I'm so proud to be here. And I want us to do more. And I look forward to work with you more on these issues, because it's all of our fight, it's all of our society. Hatred, it's a global pandemic, not just COVID. Hatred is a global pandemic that we need to fight together. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you so much for hosting this.
Thank you so much for sharing those remarks. Uplifting, after the past few days and stuff, and we certainly appreciate the work that your office is doing, that the embassy is doing, particularly here, in the community locally, there's a lot of work that you do. So it is my pleasure to turn things over to Tema Smith, who is ADL's Director of Jewish Outreach and Partnerships. She's going to serve as our moderator for tonight's discussion. By way of background for everybody, Tema is a diversity advocate. She's a writer. She's a Jewish community builder. She really is a community builder. I cannot stress that enough. She also is a recent recipient of the JPRO 2022 Young Professionals Award, and she's a contributing columnist to The Forward. Tema often writes, she speaks, she trains, she does a lot of work on racial equity and diversity, anti-Semitism for synagogues, Jewish organizations, and community groups, and all across North America. And so with that, Tema, I think you're going to turn the screen. All right.
Good. I think I'll start from here and then invite everyone up in just a second. We are running I was also running the camera, so it feels very weird to do introductions sitting at this table. It feels very official, but thank you so much, Meredith. It is so great to be here with you all today, those of you in person, and it's so wonderful to see a room of people. I can't get over this, and everyone watching from home. It's my great pleasure to briefly introduce you to our panelists before we dive in. And why don't you two join me up here? So come on up. As they're walking up, I'll start the introductions. So Carmel Tanaka, just about to sit next to me, is a queer neurodivergent jupinese woman of color and the founder of JQT Vancouver, Genocide Prevention BC, and cross-cultural walking tours. A granddaughter of Holocaust survivors and interned Japanese Canadians, she is currently conducting an oral history project through ADL's Collaborative for Change Fellowship, exploring the intersection of being Japanese and Jewish and the lived and intergenerational experiences of anti-Asian racism and anti-Semitism in Canada, the US, Japan, and Israel. Next to Carmel is Matthew Weisbly, the Education and Communications Coordinator for the Japanese American Citizens League National, based in Los Angeles. A longtime JACL member, he served as the youth representative for the Arizona chapter and as the inaugural Ted T. Namba Fellow for the Pacific Southwest District, and former Daniel K. Inouye, did I say that right? Say it for me. In a way. I should have asked first. I knew I was going to get this wrong. Fellow for JACL National in Washington, D.C. He graduated from University of Southern California, where his senior honors thesis explored demographic data and oral histories of Nisei soldiers with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Before we dive in, and we're going to have a lot of amazing conversation, just some practical details. We've reserved time at the end of the program, at the end of the conversation part of the program, for questions from both the in-person audience and everyone tuning in virtually. If you are tuning in virtually, in person is a little bit more obvious. You'll put up your hand, I'll call on you, it'll be great. But if you are tuning in virtually, please submit questions via the Q&A function, which you can find on the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. I'll be moderating questions from the in-person audience, and Maddie Solomon, ADL's coordinator for Jewish Outreach and Partnerships, will be collecting and collating questions from our Zoom audience. So without further ado, Carmel and Matthew, thank you so much for being here. So this is an old version of my questions, but that's okay. I will vamp. We're good. So first, I would just love to ask both of you to share a little bit about yourselves and your journeys to come and join us here today. So, anything that you want to share about your identities, your relationships to your cultures, and all of these sorts of things, and then we'll dive in further from there. So Carmel, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for all coming here and for tuning in. It's also Asian and Jewish Heritage Month in Canada, so it's across North America, not just here in the US. I am from Vancouver originally, on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I will do a land acknowledgement here for DC. Here on the Indigenous lands of the Nacotchtank and the Piscataway peoples. and I say Haishka in the Alchemilam language. Thank you very much to ADL for having me and for selecting me as one of your fellows for the Collaborative for Change. It's very exciting to do this project, the Jupinese Oral History Project, personally, because I get to meet other people such as Matt and many others who are of both Jewish and Japanese descent as myself. And for personal reasons, I think a lot of us are on different pages in our journey of where we're at Jewishly or Japanesely, especially the differences between, Japanese Canadian and Japanese American and what has happened to our people here in North America during World War II. And I'm excited to see how that manifests both, as simply as fusion recipes, how are we, what do we do when we grow up? Do we eat matzo ball, ramen soup, which I'm going to be doing at Shalom Japan in Brooklyn soon with 15 other Japanese people. But also the deeper questions, how did intergenerational trauma affect everyone in our family, those who spoke, those who didn't speak. And I want to thank you again for your opening speech, because addressing the shootings and everything that's happening in the US as a Canadian is quite terrifying to come here and quite daunting, especially since I flew through Buffalo. And I'm now here. And as someone who is a member of both the queer community, the Jewish community, and the Asian community, I'm personally affected by what's happened in Orlando, Florida, with the Pulse shooting, Pittsburgh, the Jewish synagogue, as well as what happened recently in Atlanta. And I'll be diving into more of all of this, but I just want to thank you for allowing me to invite all of my identities into this space and to be loud and proud, both Jewishly, Japanesely, and queerly. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can go. I will say this is the first time I think in a long time I've given sort of my family history that's made me this excited to share it. So I identify as a 5th generation Gosei Japanese American on my mom's side, as well as a 4th generation Chinese American on my mom's side. So she herself is mixed ethnicity. And on my dad's side, I'm a 4th generation Jewish American. And I always take pride in those numbers and where my family comes from because of what they fought for to get to this point where I'm sitting now. My Japanese family immigrated in the late 1800s as part of that really first wave of Japanese immigrants who came to the US, working on the plantations in Hawaii, then moving to the US mainland, and of course, suffering through the injustices of incarceration here in the US. My grandfather was 7 years old when Pearl Harbor happened, and was one of the 120,000 who was sent to one of the 10 incarceration camps across the country. His family was forcibly removed and relocated from Northern California to the deserts of Arizona, where he spent the rest of his life. And on my Chinese side, my family came around 1911, just before the first revolution there in 1912, and came to the US in hopes of a better life. Of course, still reeling with the inequalities of the Chinese Exclusion Act that happened 40 years earlier. But he came here and did his best and raised his family and became one of the first Asian American lawyers in the US and one of the first Asian American members of a state government in Arizona, again, of all places, in 1946. And it was there that my mom's grandparents, my mom's dad and my mom's mom met. And of course, on my Jewish side, they escaped the pogroms in Russia in the late 1800s. And again, we're looking for that better life here in the US. And came here and made their way from New York all the way out west to California, where my dad and his family is from. And their extended family, of course, like many others, were stuck in Europe during World War II and it suffered through the Holocaust there. And I think it's all those trials and tribulations that they went through, which is why I'm here today. My grandparents and my parents always instilled in me that sense of community and that sense of doing what's right. And it traces back to my great-grandpa on my Japanese side, starting in Arizona, really building up that Asian American community. And I think for me, I grew up knowing about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I grew up knowing about the Holocaust, but I think it was really first learning about the incarceration experience for Japanese Americans that really set me on that path and made me want to study history in college and want to do more of this work. As you heard in my bio, I've been in JACL a long time, and it wasn't until I was in high school that I realized that JACL was more than a social club with picnics and bowling leagues, in places where I got to see my friends and eat the food I like. It was more than that. It was had this long history of civil rights and fighting for others and fighting for the community. And I think all of those obviously culminate in me, and that's why I'm so proud to be what I am and why I'm here today.
That was just listening to both of you talk about what brought you here today. I'm just so honored to be able to do this work, and to be able to also, as a person of mixed racial descent, Jewish person, for those of you who don't know me, my father is African-American from New York. My mother is Ashkenazi Jewish from Toronto. So, you know, being able to sit at a table, sort of embodying both a cross-border, hybrid identity, but also a Jewish and hybrid identity. It's just such an honor to sit and have this conversation with you. So one of the things that came up as we were really diving in was some significant differences between Canadian and US experiences for the Japanese community, communities that settled in both countries historically. And I was hoping both of you could share a little bit more about what some of those differences are and how they've shaped the realities for communities today. Want to go first?
Sure. I think one of the biggest differences we talked about was, as you heard, I kept saying the word incarceration. For many people, they've probably heard the terminology internment, and I know in Canada that's the preferred terminology. And I think that was one of the most shocking things I learned about was, why do we call it incarceration? Why is it called internment there? And the few times I've accidentally called it incarceration when talking to Japanese Canadians and seeing them get upset about it and understanding that. And I think it comes down to just how different our communities were at the time when the war began. Out here in the US, of course, 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated, and of those 120,000, 2/3, like my grandpa, like my great grandpa, were all American citizens. And for us in the community, we've come to adopt this term incarceration because it really means you are incarcerating American citizens, whereas internment means you're incarcerating possible enemy aliens. Mm-hmm. And there were internment camps here, of course. There were camps set up for people who weren't citizens, but the vast majority of those incarcerated were American citizens. And that's why we've come to this conclusion that we use the term incarceration versus internment.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important distinction as well when talking. And something that I deal with quite regularly, and maybe a lot of Japanese Canadians do, is often the N is left out in the word internment. And so you hear interning, which is a completely different word, but it hits nonetheless and causes continuing trauma because essentially that's the root of that word. I appreciated you going over the terminology. There's many others that we use as well, whether it's Japanese Canadian or Japanese American, and it's not to be confused with people who come from Japan and have immigrated after the war. There are differences. Some other terms that come to mind, if you look on Google Map and you look in Vancouver, you'll see Japantown. And Japantown is not the term that our community in Vancouver and the Japanese Canadian community tend to use, but it is used in California, and there's quite, it's warmly accepted. That is not necessarily the case across borders. So just being aware of some of these differences is important. We refer to the Japanese Canadian community area during World War II in Vancouver as Pauerugai, after Powell Street, but L and R is difficult in the Japanese language. So instead of Powell, it's Paueru. Some other major differences, which I think are important to note. Here in America, in January 1945, Japanese Americans were allowed to return to their homes, their businesses, and to carry on with their lives. That was not the case in Canada. The internment continued until 1949 for another 4 more years. All of our businesses, our homes, completely taken away, never returned. And in 1949, we officially did become citizens and were allowed to vote again. But we were given an ultimatum to either return to Japan, many of whom, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were interned, were given the choice. And to go back to Japan when you might not know the language anymore, or language evolves over time, and many of them had come much earlier than the 1940s. Like my Jichan, my grandfather, came in 1928 on the Empress of Asia, and to this day I'm told that the Japanese language that this community spoke continued to evolve in Japan, but stayed stagnant in Vancouver. So you can imagine the language difficulties, especially if you only knew English, returning to Japan. And that was 4,000 people who returned. The other option was to remain east of the Rockies. And there's a very famous slogan, a very racist slogan, and I will quote, "No Japs east of the Rockies," no, west of the Rockies, I should say. And that meant not being able to return to our farming, our fishing communities, all of the businesses that we were part of. That included my family. We were originally from Prince Rupert, Port Essington actually, but if you know the map a little bit, Haida Gwaii Island, it's across from there. We were taken down to Vancouver, held in the animal livestock building of the PNE, which is our Six Flags equivalent. 10,000 people were detained here and then sent off to different internment camps. And New Denver is the one that my family was sent to. And I'm the only person to return from my family to New Denver. And I recently did that in the last few years. And it was very emotional to be able to go there and to see what really happened to my family. Now, of course, the similarities between our two experiences is that in 1988, there was national redress both in the US and in Canada. The Americans spearheaded that, and there was an official apology, and I believe each survivor received $20,000 US. In Canada, acknowledging that we didn't receive any of our possessions, they acknowledged this by saying, well, you get 21,000 Canadian dollars. Now, I believe it was accounted back in 1986 that what was actually taken was $443 million worth. And this doesn't include mental health trauma or inflation or having to rebuild one's lives, but that in today's money would be $1 billion. And I'll just end by saying that on May 21st, just a few days ago, the BC Premier, John Horgan, and the provincial government of BC announced a $100 million community fund. Again, there should be a few more zeros added to that. But I am thankful that our provincial government has taken this action to apologize. Unfortunately, it is very late in the day. My grandparents, they passed away in the 80s, some of them before even the official apology, the national apology. So I will end there. But those are some of the differences between Canada and the US when it comes to the Japanese North American experience during World War II.
Thanks for sharing the historical experience and how it has carried forward. We heard in the opening remarks from everyone who spoke about rising hate crimes, rising hate incidents globally in the US, in Canada. And this is something, of course, that is impacting, I would say, almost disproportionately racialized and Jewish communities and queer communities. And I'd love to hear both of you, as people who live in multiple targeted communities, talk a little bit about what we're seeing right now and how the communities that you inhabit are responding.
Yeah, I mean, I can go first. I think I started working at JACL officially in the summer of 2019, right after graduating college. And of course, we all know what happened about 8 months down the road from that, which we're still in. But I think for me, going from just finishing college and experiencing all these amazing, wonderful things in Los Angeles and getting to be around the community that I never had in growing up in Phoenix, and of course, coming out here to Washington, D.C. and seeing how different things were, it was very eye-opening. And then immediately switching from a lot of the work we did to now having to deal with rising anti-Asian hate, and of course, at the same time, seeing this anti-Semitism rising. even before that, but of course getting worse with it. It was heartbreaking and it was saddening. And I was very, very proud to be where I was because we took on that challenge as a community, as an organization, and joined with so many others, not only in the AAPI community, but throughout other communities of color, and worked together to find ways to combat this hatred from all sorts of angles, from the grassroots effort, from the policy level, from the national level, state, federal, everything. And finding those moments where we could still find celebration and still find moments to celebrate and things to be happy about in amongst all of these things that hate has truly been what's kept us going. And especially now as we're starting to come out of, hopefully come out of COVID, getting to be in person again and getting to do all these events that we couldn't do for the last 2.5 years has really been driving us on. I mean, for us, we just completed our second in-person leadership summit with our friends over at OCA this past weekend. And it was amazing to see all these young leaders, mostly young, there's a few older folks, which are always also great to have. But these leaders who really want to make a difference in the community because they've seen what's been happening in these 2 years. And from all over the country in varying degrees of involvement in their communities, wanting to do something about it and wanting to make that change. And I think that's been really the driving force behind all of this. And having friends and family and seeing the outpour of support from so many others has been the best part of it. And I really hope that some of you watching and everyone in here has seen the difference that it's made just by being there for us and also by voicing your own support for it.
Yeah, I will add to that, that I was invited by the Vancouver Asian Film Festival to help with creating a community reporting system to keep track of anti-Asian racist incidents that were happening in Vancouver. And I was engaged to do this because as a community engagement professional, I have a few mitts and a few pies, and they wanted to get the solidarity from many other marginalized communities. And of course, I was more than happy to participate. But as I was sitting and listening, I couldn't help but think, you know, the Jewish community has had a community self-reporting mechanism for quite some time. I believe it was 1982 that ADL began that.
79.
79. So, okay.
I was like, someone
So,
from ADL in this room
someone
is
will
gonna
know here. And this is, you know, old news for the Jewish community to see how the increased number of incidents have happened over the decades. And here is the Asian community in Canada for the first time entertaining the thought of doing this. And so I was able to see in real time this incredible movement based actually again with the initiative of Asian Americans with Stop AAPI campaign, Stop AAPI Hate campaign. And, you know, to model, you know, the forms that they were using as well in Canada, and that there were like probably 20 or 30 different Asian communities in Canada trying to do the same thing. Anyway, I found it fascinating that we are two communities that feel the need, not even feel, but we have a need to be able to document the hate that is being thrown and targeted at us. And that the majority of the hate incidents, because we can't call them crimes, it doesn't reach the threshold of a hate crime, according to authorities. And this will include verbal abuse, being spat on in the streets, stuff that unfortunately we're seeing right across the continent. Yes, I have some stats to share. This is where my nerd cap comes on, but I think it's really important, and I don't mean to really do too much comparison because I really don't want to get too into oppression Olympics here, but I think it's really important to demonstrate both what's happening here in Canada and the US with these two communities. So indulge me if you would. So in 2019, there were over 2,000 reported incidents of anti-Semitism, which intensified during the pandemic, according to B'nai B'rith Canada. In 2021, about 2,700 reported incidents of anti-Semitism in the US, according to ADL. In 2021, 1,500 or more reported incidents of anti-Asian racism since 2020 in Canada, according to Project 1907, of which 943 were in just 2021 alone. 2021, 10,300 reported incidents of anti-AAPI racism since 2020 in the US, according to Stop AAPI Hate. And according to Project 1907, in 2021, per capita, Canada has more reported incidents than the US by 100%, and BC continues to have the most reported incidents per capita of any North American province, territory, or state. That includes California, New York, and Washington. And these are very disturbing facts, the fact that they're escalating, they're not decreasing by any means. And when initially the work that I was doing, we were putting out the report saying, you know, we're seeing proof is in the data that there's an increase in anti-Asian racism and we got to do something about it. We were met with silence and no one wanted to hear us. And it wasn't until we were killed in Atlanta that all of a sudden there was a sudden interest in what's happening to our community. And that's a presentation for another day of why that is the case. But it's really important that we stand in solidarity with one another because it's happening to all of us.
Yes, it is. And our CEO at ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, has a sentence I hear him say often, which is our safety is in solidarity. And I really feel that strongly. And so this is why events like this are so important. So I'm gonna close out with a little bit of a pivot to like the happy territory. Now that we've brought everyone down, and then we'll open the floor to some questions. You both have spoken about embodying hybrid identities, and some of you have probably heard the term jupinese thrown around. And so I want to ask just really quickly, recognizing that I think we're going to have some really great audience questions tonight. What does being jupinese mean to you?
That's always one of those loaded questions.
The good, the bad, the ugly, right. All of the.
I mean, in my life, and I think looking back on my own life, it's those moments when I can bring together being Japanese and Jewish. And the earliest one that comes to mind is growing up as a kid having a yarmulke with sushi on it. And I still have it to this day, and it was always my favorite as a kid. And having those family photos of Hanukkah where my dad's the only white guy in the room, when I'm surrounded by plenty of Japanese and Chinese friends and family members who probably have never celebrated Hanukkah before, but they did because my mom married a Jewish guy. And then later on, getting to study and really learn more about what it meant to be Japanese and Jewish and where those points of intersection come throughout our history, whether it's during World War II, where there were Japanese American soldiers who liberated concentration camps, liberated Dachau and were not recognized for it, or a Japanese diplomat saving tens of thousands of Jews during the Holocaust. And of course, the Jewish American community being one of the first to support redress for Japanese Americans in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And studying all that throughout college, and then finally meeting other people who are Japanese and Jewish like I was, because as a kid in Arizona, I thought I was the only one, except my brother and my sister, of course. But it was really, it was finding these things and having my bar mitzvah, and again, bringing all the Asians to synagogue for the first time, and having Japanese food along with Jewish food at the reception, and being gifted a ceramic fortune cookie that says Oy vey on it. And I still have that too. It sits on my desk every day. But yeah, I think it's always been about those things where I can celebrate my identity and where they come together, and getting to explore that and share that with so many people. I mean, the best part is walking up to people and saying I'm Jewish, or saying I'm Japanese, Chinese, and Jewish, and then just having a look of shock on their face because they're like, oh, I've never met someone who's Asian and Jewish. And getting to explain that to them is what brings a smile to my face, and again, why I do this work.
Cute. I like that. When I come to interview you in LA, I really want your kippah with
Yeah,
sushi on it. I want that.
As the person who will one day be presenting these video interviews somehow, I demand the kippah.
To answer your question, Tema, I think my answer probably will evolve over time. What it means to be jupinese, especially after conducting the Jupinese Oral History Project, which I'm beginning tomorrow, which is very exciting. My first victim is tomorrow. So I think being jupinese for me up until today so far has been a journey of just trying to gather and collect information of what's happened to my families over time. I did not know a lot of the history of what happened to the Japanese Canadian community. I did not receive that from within my family unit. I had to look elsewhere to elders who were willing to share their stories and piece information together, find names and documents that were finally released due to research projects that were happening. So it's been a bit of a longer journey for me, but I'm very proud to be Jupinese. And so if you know anyone who is Jupinese, whether they be Jupinese like Matt and I, or Jupinese by choice, or Jupinese couples, or Jupinese families, I would really be honored to be introduced to them. For those tuning in, go to Instagram at Jupinese Project. That is the best way to get in touch with me. And there is something else that I wanted to make mention is that, and I don't know if that happened here in the US, but in Canada, in my father's generation, there was a 98% intermarriage rate in the Japanese Canadian community. Now it's debated whether it's 92 or 95 or 98, but it's in the 90 percentile range, which is very, very high. And as a result, there's been a loss of language, culture, and as a result, a disassociation to the Japanese Canadian community, as well as just in general, anything Japanese. And so my journey will be hopefully soon one day. So if you've got connections to movie producers, Steven Spielberg out there, better be listening. I haven't done my roots trip. I have not been to Japan. My father has also not been to Japan. I have not been to Belarus or to Poland, where my family were killed in the Holocaust. And these are things that I think are very important to do in order to help figure out your identity. And so you can ask me that question in another year.
There is something poetic about evolving identities. And I think all of our identities obviously evolve all the time, but as we learn more of pasts that have been silenced, I think the evolution takes on particular salience.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much for sharing. We have time to take a few questions from the room, and we're going to see if anyone is asking us questions on Zoom. It looks like we have a few from Zoom. So if anyone in the room wants to ask a question, otherwise I'll go to Zoom and just keep watching for hands. Yes.
Yeah, well, this is a nerdy question, but I'm curious about this. We Jews have a long history of being hated, and you know, we killed Jesus, and we controlled the media and banks, and you know, we made matzah out of the blood of somebody, and so there are all these they call these tropes or memes, or I don't know what the language is, but anyway. I'm sort of, other than World War II, what are the haters, what's their beef, if you will, with the Japanese, other than that you just don't look white and like that sort of white community that they're not immigrants, but this country. So what's their what are the things they tell themselves about makes you unacceptable?
Thank you for your question. I'm happy to go first. There's a long history of anti-Asian racism in Canada, and it dates very far back to as soon as any Asian people were immigrating and settling to the shores of BC. There's the Chinese head tax. There's the Pacific Railway workers using free labor, essentially. There's the anti-Asian Anti-Asiatic League, essentially a white mob that came in to destroy Asian businesses in Vancouver over a 3-day period. There's the Komagata Maru, which is a Sikh Punjabi ship that came through and was denied entry access into Vancouver shores and were later returned, and many of them were killed. It goes on and on and on. There's the Darcy Island, a leprosy colony that Asian people who contracted leprosy were forced to go to. I mean, I can send you all of this information so that you can be educated on that. And the reasons for it is resources. The Asian communities were predominantly involved in the fishing industry, which was a very lucrative business at the time. And they had, well, they essentially dominated the industry, and the way in which to rid Japanese people from the areas to get a hold of their fishing industry and farming industry is by getting rid of them. And so it was a very easy excuse to intern them, even though they all knew and all the politicians knew that they posed no threat to Canada. So it was for our ships. And I will end with a story that I recently found out from my father. I knew of, but I wanted to make sure I got the details correct before I shared it anywhere publicly. So the story goes, he was talking to his mom, so my bacha, my Japanese grandmother, and she was having some windows redone. And the person who came in, the contractor, I believe is a Nelson Anderson, but I might be wrong on the name. But anyway, this white chap comes in and he's upgrading the windows. And he looks over and he sees this picture of this boat, the Port Essington, it was called. And he says, "Oh, Mrs. Tanaka, what do you have my uncle's boat hanging on your wall?" It was her father's boat, the packer that was used to go all around the Pacific Ocean to have the local fishermen come and bring in their boats. It was all to get the resources. Good times.
I can quickly go over the Asian American history also. If it didn't say in my bio, I'm a history major, so this is what I love doing. But yeah, it was the same thing here. It was about resources. Chinese Americans came over in the mid 1800s looking for a better life and were welcomed during the gold rush at first. And then as the gold dried up, they were blamed for it drying up and taking all that money. And then as they moved on and worked on the railroad and worked in other industries, they were, I mean, much like today, as other immigrants come in, they were blamed for taking jobs and taking money away from working Americans, and especially in the post-Civil War economy, which of course led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first and largest law that prohibited an entire ethnic group from coming to the US. And later on, it was Japanese Americans who filled that void. And then as they spread throughout the West Coast, Japanese Americans were very big in fishing, but also the farming industry here. And it was white farmers throughout the West Coast who were upset that Japanese Americans were doing so well with their farms in lands that no one had thought to cultivate before, that white farmers had just passed off as not being farmable and doing really well with them. And then they passed laws that prohibited Japanese Americans from owning land and other Asian Americans from owning land. And Japanese Americans found a way around that too and kept thriving. And it was just about, again, the resources and just being seen as an other and taking away these resources from Americans, from other Americans. And it happened after World War II too. I mean, with Korea and Vietnam, and then in the 80s with the auto industry and people blaming Japan for the destruction of Detroit and that auto industry. And of course, we're coming up on the anniversary of Vincent Chin's death, which is a result of that as well. And now it's China. I mean, even before COVID, it was talking about China being the economic powerhouse and taking all these jobs and money and infrastructure away from the US. Yeah.
And taking all the spots in the universe.
Yeah, and I think also one thing to add to that, to conclude this question, is that both Jewish and Asian communities are considered model minorities, and as a result are targeted because you can be an easy scapegoat as such. And for those who are not familiar with the term model minority, is where a minority group perceived to have higher success than the average population. And this is used to really discriminate. Right. So in the context of the universities, for example, you know, sort of asserting that Asian Americans don't need any sort of racial consideration in entering the universities because they're smarter anyway and are taking all the spots, et cetera, et cetera. Any other questions from in the room? And I have a few from the Zoom room. Okay, I'll give you all some time to think. We're gonna do like maybe 2 more questions because I know we're a little bit late, but this has been just such a interesting conversation. I'm learning a lot as well. So there's a question that came in for you, Carmel, that I think is relating to some of the things that Matt shared about his upbringing. And somebody from the Zoom audience wants to know, what in your upbringing stands out in the context of your identity as a jupinese person? I wonder who asked that. No.
Are your parents
I
watching?
think maybe my mom might be asking that. Please repeat the question again.
What in your upbringing stands out in the context of your identity as a jupinese person?
I was gonna go back to elementary school and talk about my love of math and music and being just like the best student in the class. Definitely the pressure from both sides of the family. I still love you. I did not become a lawyer or a doctor, but I definitely do life-affirming work in the community engagement work that I do today. So I hope that makes you proud, Mom and Dad. You know, for the longest time, I didn't know the difference between Japanese and Japanese Canadian. And I think I've already talked to you about the fact that I'm still learning this history. But for the long time, my only connection to anything Japanese was Sailor Moon, the animated TV show, which super obsessed about. But then also going to the local Japanese grocer to pick up ingredients to make sushi. Out of all the things that stayed as far as traditions in our family that are Japanese, would be food. Making sure that we had futomaki and inari at New Year's and omochi, which is one of my favorites, which are sweet rice cakes. And the trip to these like full-on Japanese markets for me were very exotic because I knew nothing about it. I didn't know the language. People who kind of look like my dad. Certainly I look a little bit like them, but obviously not. But then, you know, being Jewish, I have to say, growing up visibly as a minority in the Jewish community has not been easy. But despite having Jupinese parents, having Jupinese children, I am Jewish just like everyone else in this room who identifies. I'm still very much engaged in the Jewish community, albeit a thorn probably in some of your sides, trying to push for inclusion of those who are marginalized and on the periphery of the Jewish community. That's queer and trans Jews, Jews of color, patrilineal Jews, neurodivergent and disabled Jews. I mean, we're here, we're not going anywhere. We've always been here and we're very proud to be here and we want to be a part of the community. And so I'm very proud to be able to grow up as a Jupinese person who can today make the future better for Jupinese people and then some, because it's not just one identity, we hold so many. And I think it's time to adopt an open tent for everyone in our community.
And a final question before we close, and I'm going to give you a choice between 2, but please keep your answer short and pithy. So this is the like multiple choice round or choose your own adventure round. Either, what does I think I'm actually just going to combine them into one question. What does allyship between and within Jewish and Japanese communities look like to you? And do you have a message of hope for people fighting hate and anti-Semitism today? Mashing that together. And we'll have time for everyone in the room if things come up to do a little schmoozing so you can ask directly, but let's wrap up on that.
Oh, it's another loaded one. Okay. Allyship, I would say, like you heard from earlier, it's not transactional. It's not you show up for me, I show up for you. It's being there all the time and supporting one another just because that's the right thing to do. And just because we all suffer from hate. So why not stand in it together and relish in each other's company when those bad times come? And the message of hope, I would say, is, I mean, we're here. We've survived. Jews have survived thousands of years of hate. Japanese and Asian Americans and Asian Canadians have been here in the Northern Hemisphere for over 100 years, 150 years, 200 years, ever since colonization happened. But we've been here and we've made the best of our lives here. And we're products of all of our grandparents, great grandparents, and all of our ancestors went through. And I couldn't be more proud to be here and relish in the accomplishments that they made and in being able to bring me here.
When it comes to allyship, I think what's really important to remember is that you cannot self-appoint yourself as an ally. It is bestowed upon you. You need to be vetted by our communities. We need to see action, not lip service for these thoughts and prayers, as was stated earlier today. One of the things that I do in one of my projects, I do many projects, but I try to, in each and every way, share our stories collectively together, because I think that is really the only way that we will be able to build bridges across our siloed communities. One of the projects I run is the cross-cultural walking tours, and just like communities that you're familiar with in California, in the Bay Area, Vancouver also had an early immigrant settling community, and everyone was living together. The Jews, the Blacks, the Italians, the Ukrainians, the Irish were not also considered white at that time. Interesting how times changed. The Chinese community, the Japanese community, everyone was living together. And so the walking tours take you through the history of historically what has happened to each of these communities over the many decades and the waves of the immigration. There's even one house that begins with a Jewish rabbi and then gets taken over by a Chinese community. It's actually quite fascinating. Anyway, food for thought for another time. And then talking about the current struggles of the downtown East Side community in Vancouver today, which is grappling with the homeless crisis as well as the opioid crisis, all of which are very important to be addressing. And you can see it's a systemic pattern of oppression of marginalized communities in Vancouver. History repeats itself, and I'm trying very hard to combat that in all the ways that I know how.
Thank you both. One of the things that's such a profound honor in my role as Director of Jewish Outreach and Partnerships at ADL is being able to convene conversations like this with Jews from diverse backgrounds who face anti-Semitism and unique manifestations because of the other identities they also embody, as well as anti-Semitism in all the classical manifestations, as well as other oppressions. And so this is the first panel I've convened in this role, and I am so thrilled to have had this cross-border, cross-cultural, in-person and online panel tonight, and it is just an honor to be here with you. For everyone watching and everyone in the room, please stay tuned. We're going to have much more. And as we mentioned at the beginning of today, this is just one of a series of initiatives. If you're interested in participating in future initiatives, oh, sorry, Meredith, I'm taking your comments. Yeah, I missed the cue. I read my name. It is what it is. Okay. If you're interested in participating in future initiatives between ADL and the Japanese American Citizen League, please email Maddie Solomon at msolomon@adl.org. And of course, thank you to all of you for taking time to be here with us today. Stay safe, continue to be well, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you at another conversation like this in the future. There will be refreshments just out in the hallway here and some